and the Planning Commission requested that that be changed. They were concerned that we would have tall structures on smaller lots, so in 2009 they increased that on that 1:5 ratio that I mentioned. So the applicant did get the Planning Commission approval for the special structure permit, and the sidewalls can go to the 22 feet. So specifically at issue here, if you see that bubble, two bubbled areas that are red, when that end wall meets the side, it's got a vertical surface. And so it's our interpretation that that exceeds the sidewall height limit. So it's a little tricky here because it's kind of a small sliver that exceeds it when you're just looking at that side. Most projects we see have kind of a larger area, but our code doesn't define that. It doesn't say, you know, you can have a small part of the wall exceed the height limit, or, you know, it doesn't have any objective criteria in which to evaluate that. So we try to treat all projects fairly across the board. There's so many different designs that come in. We really try to implement our code requirements on all projects fairly. And as you know, we do not have design review. And so most communities have design review, and that's how they're able to get more subjective design criteria established. I know there was a question as to what Portola Valley's regulations are with regard to this. I was able to look at their code online. I also was able to talk to a planner today there. And they have a maximum height limit of 28 foot on a level lot, about an acre, so that would compare well to most of our properties. And it's a max 28 foot height. So they don't have any sidewall end walls. She never heard of such a thing. She's a little surprised. But they do have detailed design review. And so through that design review process, they would handle all the articulation, so they wouldn't see the big box that I showed you in the earlier slide. So the other issue then is, I'm sorry.
Question.
Yes.
I have a question. So in that prior diagram, given the given the special permit that was received for the 23-foot height, does that meet the code but for those little fins that
it complies with the exception of what I would consider to be the roof parapet walls. So this is the 23 feet is right to there, so that increased height gets that part. This back here is the tower element that I mentioned that is allowed to go all the way up to the 30 foot. And then it's these parapet walls here at that side elevation that we feel is that issue. And the applicant, I'll show you their previous version, the parapet wall kind of went all the way around. And so this was their design solution to try to accommodate our code.
So in fact, if it's a little hard to see on the diagram, but if that little, what you call the parapet wall, what looks like a little fin extension to me on the roof, on the left one, if it were along the wall, it could be considered the end wall and satisfy the code, but in the middle one...
Well, it's only an issue when it's the side here. So it's very difficult to do anything above, like I said earlier, the 22 feet.
It's over the 23 feet, right?
That's correct.
Right.
It's on top of the 23 feet.
But it doesn't come all the way to the side.
No, but it's the same vertical plane. You know, it's a vertical element that exceeds the 23 feet. So it would be easier to see if it was a wide wall. Maybe if it was 5 feet, you would really get that visual. But since it's pretty narrow, it's kind of hard to visualize that.
So, so the appeal, though, is an appeal of the planning department's review of the
interpretation of the code.
Right.
Correct.
All right. So, are these little sidewalls, parapets, are they there to shield, say, rooftop mechanical systems?
Yeah, I don't believe so, but I can have the architect explain the design theory and the reason for those elements.
Okay. And then, if I can ask one more. Sure. Sorry. And then also, when I looked at the garage and the guest house, it looked like the guest house was going to go up to 11 feet, but it looks like these side structures or separate structures are all going to be, for the most part, glass walls up. And we just passed an ordinance, I thought, that said that we would not have glass walls, windows above 9 feet.
It could not face the side of the property line, it could face the interior.
And that's what these are?
I believe so. So at issue with the accessory structure, again, you know, on that elevation there, it could go all the way, I believe this is 14 feet high, it could go to 15, but it's this side here, where it's a sidewall, that it violates the sidewall height limit because it reaches the full height to the roof line. So what we would normally see is something more like this, where this is considered the roof,
Right.
and it has some eave overhang over the wall beyond, and that wall is at 11 foot in that location.
Yeah, and so it wasn't clear whether or not, what the orientation was and what was going to be the front and the side as to, at least from when I looked at the document, as to whether or not we were also violating that ordinance that we just passed a couple months ago.
Yeah.
But if we could find out,
Sure.
is the parapet up there, is it going to shield anything, or is it just decorative?
Right, the architect can review that. And then just if I could give, if this is something, the city council has obviously quite a few options before you tonight. One, I think you should decide on the appeal, the merits of that, and if you wish to provide staff with alternate direction in order to enforce this code in the future. And one option is, and I actually saw this exact application come in the other day, I met over the counter, somebody wants to go to the full 30-foot height for a wall all along the length of the end elevation of the project, but it's got this width here at the sidewall. And so I explained to them that that would be in violation of the code. They're trying to figure out something creative. I said they could do a tower. They asked if the whole wall could be a chimney, so I'm not sure that works. But if the city council would like to see something like this and some flexibility, you could provide direction that we do allow end wall to reach the full 30 feet, and that at the side elevation, it's no more than whatever the minimum code requirement is for the building code. And that's going to vary based on soil condition and the structural type of construction. So it could be, maybe a foot or 2 feet wide, and maybe that's not bad. My concern, though, is if I don't get some specific direction tied to something else, that somebody could come in and say, well, for the balance of the architectural design, I need it to be 10 feet wide. And I respect that. I understand, their architectural integrity. These are beautiful homes, highly skilled architects, so I really understand that, but I need something more objective that we can evaluate too. And so that's just a suggestion if you wanted to provide me with some direction on how to interpret this different in the future, and then grant the appeal. The council could also decide that no, staff's decision was not wrong and you agree with the interpretation, there you would deny the appeal. They would come in with some alternate plans. And then lastly, after you act on the merits of the appeal, you could also provide direction, and I could come back with a resolution that this is an item you'd like to study further. I did bring it up with the 2009 code update, and at that time the Planning Commission was not interested in studying it further. I also brought it up, and the applicant did as well, before the Planning Commission for some direction while we talked about the special structure permit. At that time, the Planning Commission did not give us alternate direction on our interpretation, and they also did not give direction to bring it back for further consideration. So I took it as they were satisfied. It wasn't formal action, though, it was just direction at the meeting because we were talking about the special structure permit. So it is something that I can bring back a resolution to initiate an amendment to that code section. You can direct the Planning Commission to study it further. Be happy to answer any of your questions, and the architect is here as well and would like to give a presentation.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful because I believe the architect has a model. If I'm not mistaken, it would be helpful to sort of leave you open, but also to hear what he has to
Sure.
say. Seeing the model
His
might
graphics
help
are going to
us.
be much better than mine.
That's what I was thinking. Might help us in determining what we're looking at.
Put the model up here if you'd like.
Close to me, better I need glasses. Oh, perfect.
I know. Can you move ahead? Oh, sure. Oh, then you're ready. Thanks.
So I think that's the.
No, I think that's.
So Rick, I think that's the thing you're referring
They
to.
don't get many models to play with, so this is exciting.
Right.
Good evening. I'm,
Do you want to talk about your time?
well, I'll just go as quickly as I possibly can.
Thank you.
My name is Robert Swat, principal of Swat Myers Architects. I've been with me and Milwaukee, who is project architect working on 81 Atherton Avenue. We've done quite a few projects in this town. We're proud of every single one. They've all been great projects, and we have a good working relationship with the planning staff. It's always been a pleasure to work with them. As the deputy planner explained, the Atherton code for height limits is based on traditional designs. That's why there are two different height limits. The goal of the code is to limit the mass and bulk of the architecture. We agree with the intent. We think the wording is vague, and we think it's open to interpretation. And we believe that the staff's interpretation in our case, this case, is arbitrary, and it's not consistent, in our opinion, with the intent of the code. So we're appealing the staff's interpretation of sidewalls relative to height limit. We're not suggesting in any way a change in the code. The first diagram I'd like to go to.
Sorry, this is a little delayed.
Yeah.
Okay. The first diagram shows how the end walls are measured, and how the side walls are measured, and that they're different heights. And as the deputy planner mentioned, we've been allowed to go to 23 feet high on the side walls. In modern homes in the town of Atherton, the planning staff leaves the decision of which wall is an end wall versus a side wall up to the applicant. So we have assumed that the elevation parallel to Atherton Avenue, which I'm calling east-west direction, is the end wall. It is the highest wall, and it runs, and the perpendicular wall, which runs north-south, we're calling the side wall. In this next diagram, you'll see the envelope of a traditional building superimposed on our Atherton Avenue elevation. So you'll see the tower element.
Question. So,
This is Atherton Avenue.
with this model, is Atherton Avenue on this side of the
Facing
residence?
Facing you, yes. That is Atherton Avenue.
And so that's the front of the house?
Correct.
That's the front, well,
Is that
you
the
could
front
call it the
entrance?
front. It is where the front door is, yes. Correct. Facing Atherton Avenue. Okay. In this diagram, this shows the building, possible building envelope for traditional design superimposed on our Atherton Avenue elevation. The tower element, as the deputy planner mentioned at the left, is allowed to exceed the height limit because it's a tower element, and the code specifically allows that. This is the original design, and the design looked like this, the next slide, which is the model in front of you. Okay, and this is what the design that we presented to planning staff. Planning staff rejected this and said that any wall in the plane perpendicular to Atherton Avenue, which is the sidewalk, any wall, anywhere in the building that exceeded the 23 would be considered a side wall and would have to maintain the 23-foot height. We note that dormers in traditional buildings would normally be in a sidewall condition. They have walls, they have roofs, they exceed that height. But in a modern building, in this case, it was determined that that parapet, which was a roof edge, designed to enclose a slightly taller roof over a portion of the building, was not acceptable. It's the roof edge. The next diagram is the diagram that the deputy planner showed. It shows the approved envelope of a traditional building on the left. It shows a not allowed envelope of a modern building where the whole building goes up to the height limit, and that's not approved. And we simply asked in the middle one, why can't a modern building step within the envelope of a traditional building? It only seems logical to us, and we don't see anything in the code that would prohibit it. It's just a matter of interpretation. If the staff simply allowed a step form of a parapet roof, of a roof edge, to not be called a sidewall, our building would comply with all of the planning requirements in Atherton. When this was rejected, we didn't want to go to the planning commission. We did not want to go to the town council. We rarely asked for variances, so we decided, well, we'll just solve it. So we took off the wall, that parapet wall, had to lower the roof in that one area and said, okay, we don't have a wall there in the perpendicular direction to Atherton Avenue. We then presented that to the town planning department. They rejected it and said, no, you can't do that because the end of your wall is a wall. Well, your code defines a wall. The code of the town of Atherton defines a sidewall as a wall that runs perpendicular to an end wall. And there is no wall above the 23 feet height that runs perpendicular to a sidewall. There's only an edge of a wall, and every wall has thickness. So it doesn't seem reasonable to us to call the edge of a 6-inch wide wall a wall running in an opposite direction, in a perpendicular direction. It is not reasonable to us. Okay, the next diagram. So anyway, that's how this was left. That was rejected. The next diagram shows the height limits for accessory structures. The two drawings at the left show the end wall and sidewall conditions, what's approved for accessory structures. The 1/3 to the left, second from the right, is allowed. And we could have a gigantic fascia, 5 feet high. We could have a gigantic overhang, 20 feet long, and that would be approved. And it could be approved because there's a little line that separates the wall from the roof. That means that wall is set in maybe, what, half an inch, 6 inches, I don't know what. It's an arbitrary decision made by somebody. But if that line goes away, it's no longer approved because the planning staff has determined that that edge of a wall is a wall running in the opposite, in the perpendicular direction. Which brings us to the point that I think is really important. We're talking about the language and grammar of architecture. And this is the way, I mean, you know, modern buildings are different than traditional buildings, and sometimes conditions are meant to be flush and are most beautiful when they're flush. And your code, the code is being interpreted in a way that makes it very, very difficult to create architecture like this. Anyway, this condition occurs twice. It occurs twice at the garage, as shown in this those little red squares, and it occurs also at the guest house in the corners as well. We presented this to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission could not rule on it, but this is what they had to say about it. They said, number one, they have no opposition to our design. They appreciated that the design minimized the massing. They appreciated that all structures were below the allowable height limit and were significantly below that. And they agreed with us that the code is vague and open to interpretation. They didn't say much more than that, but that's what they did say. I thought they were very supportive from everything I heard. We're simply asking for two things. We're asking that a roof parapet be allowed to step up within the envelope of a traditional building without being called a sidewall. It's just a parapet of a roof. And the second thing we're asking is that the edge of an end wall not be considered a sidewall. All it is an edge of a wall. It is not a wall running in the other direction, in our opinion. And that's what we're asking for. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any council members have any questions?
I have a question.
Please, Vice Mayor DeGolia.
On the issue of the edge of the wall not being considered a sidewall, in this case it looks to me like the roof being joined to the wall, you're calling that piece of the roof not part of the sidewall. Am I correct in that? In the diagram on the accessory structure that is not allowed, it's not allowed because the darker colored piece that's the wall is the, I assume, the 11-foot height limit, and then the roof piece that comes across the entire structure, if it joins directly to that wall, it's considered to increase the height of the sidewall. And you're saying for aesthetic purposes, there's real reasons you want that to happen. I understand that. My question is, if that were to be an interpretation and we were to revise it, how could that be abused? Because I understand what you're doing, it's not abuse, but how could somebody who wanted to abuse it then interpret it in a way that would be abusive?
Well, I don't know if I can really answer that, but all I would say is that a wall goes up to a certain height. In most architectural, firms or people who know architecture, there is a plate height. There's a place where a wall ends and a roof starts, and it's structural. It's the way buildings are built, particularly in on the West Coast, in the United States. They're built with wood frames. There's a plate height. That wall ends and the roof starts. Okay, and so it just so happens that in these designs that we're presenting and hoping to have approved, they're flush. It's a modern language. It's a modern vocabulary. That's all it is. And with regards to the ends of the walls and the roof on the main house, originally that was meant to be a higher roof, slightly higher, to give a little higher space in the living room, the main part of the house. When we couldn't achieve that, and we tried to take off that portion of the parapet to get around that, and at least have that form of that roof, we had to lower the roof because we didn't have another way to end that roof, so we had to lower it. It was not our intention to do that. But then again, we did not intend to take up your time with the town council and planning commission with this issue. We're trying to resolve this in a simpler way and not have to take a year. That's what happened.
Lisa, isn't Rick's question more so along the lines that by changing that, we could increase the mass of the wall? I mean, wouldn't that be the perception if we changed or agreed to additional height? Not that it's in your, but somebody else would say that the mass would be greater, because the perception is without a break in materials, it becomes a wall or a...
Yeah, along that end elevation, you could have a 30-foot tall wall the entire length of it. And I guess my only concern is how could it be abused. We don't have any definition of how thick that wall could be, and it could be, I think that previous slide you had, one of the, kind of the columns was much wider than, and this is very reasonable, it's pretty narrow, the thickness of the wall, I don't know what it is exactly.
The maximum is 1 foot.
The other slide. Yeah, if you see where number 2, that one section is wider. And so at what point, do we just define the thickness of a wall? I think it would be very helpful.
Excuse me if I could interrupt. On the portion that's wider, that is a end wall condition, so that can go up higher.
I understand what you're saying, but I'm trying to respond to the question of how could it be abused, and it would be for architectural integrity, we need the wider wall, or, there's going to be a request for it. Money's not an issue. We see a lot of pushing the envelope and wanting, some high quality designs, and so it could be much wider if I don't limit it. And we could limit it by kind of referencing the minimum required structurally under a building code. And in this situation, you said you had.
I think it's with finishes 1 foot.
1 foot. But there could be a different design that's got some stone on it that ends up being, 2 feet, or it could be wider. But if we limit it in some way, then that would probably be reasonable. I just don't have that in the code now, and I don't have that interpretation now. And as to the point also about that stepping up with the roof line, we don't have anything in the code that says, well, if you go in 10 feet, you go up 5. We just don't have that, and that would be an objective criteria we can certainly put in, so they could have some kind of roof parapet like that, and I understand that, but we don't have that now. So and I have a strict interpretation of the code. That's the direction we've received previously from Planning Commission and City Council. But it's certainly something we can manage.
Okay, any other questions from council?
Lisa, in your opinion, now I understand that they'd like to move on with their plans, and that's why they're here, but why wouldn't we, under normal circumstances, would we ask the Planning Commission to make an interpretation and then come back with a recommendation if they wanted to change anything, as opposed to just passing it on?
Well, the code provides that it would be an appeal to the city council, or the interpretation would go to city council. So we followed the correct process in the code.
Any other questions?
Well, one additional question. My other question would be, it appears that really this wall here was a parapet, but it's also a wall, if I'm looking at the drawing properly, as opposed to, I guess when it first looked at the top level and from the top of design, it looked like it was not necessarily part of the wall.
But this is an end wall. The problem is this piece right here is interpreted as part of the side wall.
Correct.
And they're saying that it's within the envelope of what would have been there had it been a traditional structure.
Traditional roof. Yeah.
Right.
Or rail. Any other questions? No more questions. Thank you very much. Any questions from the public on this item? Seeing no questions from the public, let's go ahead and bring it back to council for final comments. Council members, first one want to jump in?
I guess when I spoke with the city manager, he indicated, and Lisa, you could possibly talk about several other builders want to do something similar to this, and your concern is strict interpretation, or you have some additional concerns?
Well, I would go by the strict interpretation unless you provide alternative interpretation. I've given a suggestion for that. and then I can then utilize that moving forward. That, like the applicant said, you know, it's the wall and the width of the end of it, kind of minimum required by building code for structural integrity, and we can move forward with that. And that would allow this project and similar projects where it was a pretty small area.
But if we just approve this one appeal, then all the other ones still would be
I
strict
would need some
interpretation.
direction, yeah, on how you're approving
No,
this
no, no,
appeal,
no.
or you're gonna get a whole lot of other appeals.
You approve the appeal, you set a precedent
Right,
for
I-
all
Correct.
other applications. We don't
So
go
there's a-
discretion by discretion by
If
discretion.
there's an
Unless we-
approval of the appeal, then by definition, we're saying, please go back and look
Well,
at
or-
revising the ordinance.
Or you could just give direction on my interpretation, and I've given that one slide, my last slide was kind of a suggestion on what that might be. I think it's consistent with what the applicant was saying.
Councilwoman Lewis?
So, this looks like it's a beautiful, beautiful project. Quite exciting and quite different from a lot of the traditional homes in Atherton, and it, you know, will be stunning, I'm sure. I think that the way the code has been written, I mean, it's really clear that we just don't want giant monolith homes being built within a building envelope at a wall 30-foot height all around. So that's not something that we want to open the door to allow. Not that you would ever do that or design a building like that, because there's no architectural merit to that, but somebody else might, so we have to be really careful about it. The example of the gabled roof that's allowed by the code, I can understand, and that's definitely a traditional approach. The contemporary that you're showing in the middle that's not allowed is the little pop-up, and that is not what you're proposing, but that's something that I think could happen. I think it would look a little strange, but and then obviously the big blue monolith box that we don't want. The image that I see with the removal of the end wall looks like it has made it better. I'm not exactly sure why the other parapet walls have to be there, the tracks on the roof. I guess it's an extension of the back wall coming up and then driving forward. What is the setback from the end wall to the butt end of those two, I guess, parapet walls? Is it like a foot or 2 feet, 5 feet back?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
So where you?
From, she's asking from the sidewall to the end of the parapet walls,
Yeah.
what is the distance?
Is that about 5 feet
It's-
or?
No, it's
Here
probably
to
about
It's about 8 feet.
6, 7, 8 feet, 8 feet.
Mhm. And then those walls are only a foot wide?
No, they're less than that. They're like that, 6 inches.
6
6 inches,
inches.
7 inches the most.
Okay.
And that's primarily aesthetic, that wall. There's no function used for example, use of the roof.
Well, there was, as I explained.
There was a
We had
higher height for
Slightly
the.
higher roof in the main space of the home.
Uh-huh.
And that's what that was for. We also think the form of this building, having a roof laying on top of a master bedroom wing, laying on top of it, is really beautiful. And having it's very, it's architectural, and I hate to just use architectural speak on this, but it's, it's very sculptural, as these forms, engage each other, and it's not high, and it's within, I've already gone through all those arguments.
Mhm.
And we thought, we made this, we can get rid of these parapets functionally, the
Mhm.
building is not as beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, simple as that, and it's not a high building at all,
Mm-hmm.
and the building is not as beautiful, and we know that, and our clients know that, and so it's painful to us to do that when we're within an envelope that's reasonable, and we don't believe that edges of the wall constitute a wall in perpendicular direction.
So if it's on the main house, how does it fit in the accessory structure, the garage?
It's an interpretation
Mhm.
that, in this surround, that the edge of this wall
Which is,
by itself becomes a wall. So planning staff says this wall is that high. We say that wall is this high.
mhm,
And that this is the roof. And the roof turns into the wall, it's flush because that's the grammar, the language of the architecture.
mhm.
The same condition happens here. But yes, the same condition happens here and here. Happens
And
both
how close is
places.
it to the neighbors' structures, the setback?
The setback here is, Mia,
The garage
10
is
feet.
at the setback, the guest
Yeah.
house.
this is 10
10
feet.
feet.
This is the
That's
setback.
a 10 feet
for
there.
The
each
guest
setback.
house is 15 feet from the
15
side
feet on
setback,
this one.
or side property line.
So, I think one of the theories of close accessory structures would be 11-foot high, sidewall, and then your roof line retreats, and so it doesn't create, a big wall looming over close to the neighbors.
The opposition.
And even though we have landscape screening plans that you're supposed to landscape all around so that your neighbors don't see into the house, there is a period of time when that structure will be there. And so that proposed structure would then be how tall? Not 11, it'd be 14 feet?
14 feet
14
high, and the
feet.
planning staff has no problem with this wall.
The garage is 11 and a half above average natural grade, and the guest house is 14.
14.
11 and a half, that's what it is.
Okay.
But the planning staff has no problem
With that
this
one.
wall. They only have an issue with this edge right here and that edge right here.
Well, it's still not that, yeah. All right.
Thank you. Councilman Whitmer? Or, excuse me, Vice Mayor DeGolia. Who was next?
Okay, there are two different issues before us. On the issue of the main house and what's being called, I guess, the parapet, I'm very sympathetic to the idea of accommodating different architecture. We don't have an architectural standard now. I think that the principle that we all want to enforce is that there is not a greater mass authorized. And if there is a design that utilizes space within the design of what is allowed under the code, so where you look at a 30-foot high end wall, which peaks up to a gable, if there was a design that used some of that space in that triangle between the sidewall and the gable peak, which is here called a parapet, as long as it was within that envelope, I feel very sympathetic to it. I don't think that it breaches the intent of limiting the mass of buildings, which is what I think our intent is. So if there could be language that would be written to accommodate that, I think that we should support that. I want to support the creative design of intelligent, innovative architects and clients that hire them. I think it's in all of our interest to do that. I suppose we can get some weird stuff if this is a particularly beautiful building. And as long as it doesn't increase the mass, I feel sympathetic to it. I'm not opining on the issue of the secondary structure, but on this structure, that's what I think.
Councilman Whitmer?
Sure.